Welcome to the Identity in Cybersecurity podcast, where host Ian Paterson talks to industry leaders about the cybersecurity problems that companies face today and the ways in which digital identity and digital identity technologies can help to solve these problems. The Identity in Cybersecurity podcast is sponsored by Plurilock, a global leader in behavioral biometrics, anomaly detection, and other identity technologies for cybersecurity applications. Here's our host, Ian Paterson, CEO of Plurilock.
Welcome to the Identity in Cybersecurity podcast. I'm your host, Ian L. Paterson, and today I'm speaking with Ajay Sood, a seasoned IT veteran and author with over 20 years of cybersecurity experience with Symantec, FireEye, and McAfee. In this episode, we discuss how security is not just an IT problem anymore, the concept of human capital, and the growing pains of managing cybersecurity for a mid-sized company. Let's get to it. So would love to just fill the viewers in on what your background, how did you actually get started in cybersecurity?
You know, cybersecurity at the time as I got into it is one of those things that actually found me. When you kind of grow up on the computer counterculture side of things in the early 90s with the advent of the internet and computing in general, I mean, it was one of those things where I found that was what I wanted to do with my Friday and Saturday nights, right? And so I spent time doing things like BBSing, connecting to other people in other parts of the world and computers, and using protocols like Finger and Archie and Veronica and Alta Vista. Even as I say all of this stuff, I'm aging myself, but it was actually just so miraculous because it was just so new. And so when you start to play with internet technology, you start to realize very, very rapidly you could telnet into other schools and you can use their systems and you can misuse their systems. And so we used to do a lot of fun things like just everything from making big sets of eyes and GIFs and things like that pop up on screens across the country and just causing disruption. And so you start to learn how to disrupt and have fun with that sort of thing. You can rapidly see how that could spiral into an interest in internetworking and internetworking security, and more importantly, subverting it. So we all run havoc in our university school networks. And so I'd like to say the rest is history, but it really isn't, because it was actually not very, very deliberate. I had gotten through my degree in engineering and then was offered a telecom position at a large telecom provider based here in Canada. And I was bored on a break one day at school, and I applied to what I thought were the most influential networking companies on the planet. And I put as my hobby hacking. I think it was hacking TCP/IP, because remember, TCP/IP was a software package back in the day. You had to install it electively. And so I get a call from this company within 24 hours. They tell me about what you mean by hacking TCP/IP, and I told them just messing around and opening up on ports and hacking SMTP and forging email messages and doing all sorts of fun stuff like that. I was like, oh, well, we need to meet you. And so they met me, and they shipped me off to Toronto, and I ended up starting my cybersecurity career there, even though I didn't know I was doing cybersecurity at the time, because it really wasn't a field.
And so with that wealth of experience, how has just plain vanilla things like access to data, how has that changed over the last, 10 years or so, from where you started to where it has been to where we are now?
Yeah, no, in the last decade, I think the biggest change has been an evolution away from the secure enclave, and I'll qualify that. So about a decade ago, we used to buy things like firewalls, and we used to build secure enclaves on the inside of networks, DMZs, and so on, where we kept our database servers, or we kept our web servers, wherever we kept the jewels, right? And so this notion of the secure enclave became really, really important. Well, the game that we're playing right now is not so much, hey, house the data and then armor it. Now it's follow the data. Right? The data is everywhere. The data is moving. The data is moving with the users. The data is in the cloud. It's in Azure. It's in AWS. It's in Google. It can be on a handset. It can be on a watch. And so this whole notion of having a secure enclave and saying, okay, we're going to put the data here and we're going to secure it, that's over. And so many organizations today haven't figured that part out yet. And so when you start looking at the principles of identity, a lot of folks are like, oh, identity, username, and password. It's like, not really, not anymore. Now we're talking about authenticating users, yes. The users, we're talking about authenticating their devices. We're talking about authenticating their access. We're talking about their levels of access to what data at what time and what frequency. And so that data can be anywhere and live anywhere at any time. And then at the end of all of it, that data has to die. And then GDPR happened, right? And then we started talking about right to forget, voluntary, involuntary data destruction. And so you can see how data has no longer adopted this whole, hey, I've got a database of usernames and passwords and I'm leaving it in this secure enclave behind a firewall. Now I've got data that is created, data that is stored, data that is moved, data that is evolved, data that has to be kind of repudiated and authenticated in a lot of certain ways, and then that data has to be destroyed, right? And we have to do that all securely, and we have to document that, and we have to stamp it with an ISO standard. There's a lot more complex elements to data management than there ever has been. And by the way, as more and more legislation continues to get passed, specifically here in Canada, because let's have a little bit of a Canadian spin on that. We had PIPEDA last year. Penalties still, TBD, and terms still TBD. But as and when that gets more sophisticated as well, we're going to have to get a little bit more serious on how we manage our data.
So it seems like the shift has been from a technology conversation to a regulatory or a policy conversation. Given how the trend has evolved, where do you see us going in the next 10 years?
Definitely more towards the individual. When we start looking to technology as being a solution, we're rapidly going to see how quickly that technology will fail us. At the end of the day, IT became notoriously synonymous with IT security, right? When we start talking about cybersecurity, we always think of it as an IT problem. But when you start looking at the breaches and the issues that we've had over the most recent years, the people who are in the crosshairs now are like the CEOs, the CIOs, the CLOs, chief legal officers, and so on, executives. So IT security has visibility now at the highest levels, first step. The second thing here is now you're starting to look at a lot of regulatory pressure behind data management, data protection. And so, your question about, where is this going, right? It's more of a question about, look, we're going away from this just being an IT problem to being more of a regulatory problem, being more of a human issue. And I say this because I was one of those people, right? I used to believe that when you started talking about capitalization on cybercrime, we talked a little bit about, intellectual property, right? Financial capital, intellectual capital, financial capital. And we also had this third category called human capital, right? That kind of emerged. And we're like, whoa, this is kind of a new thing. But now if you look at the biggest breaches that have occurred, you're talking about Facebook, there's millions of accounts getting stolen. You're talking about insurance companies. Again, these breaches are in the millions of records, tens of millions of records. We're talking about stealing a country's worth of data, a country's worth of population information. This isn't just someone stealing your credit card and buying a subscription to magazines anymore, which, as annoying as that is, the stakes are much larger. So to your point, when you start looking at being a custodian of data, you're no longer a custodian only of intellectual capital and financial capital. And I'll even add political capital to that list, right? Because you've got political capitalization of cybercrime, right? Hey, I live in a country, you live in a country, I don't like your country, we're going to do bad stuff, right? That's also material. And so as we kind of get away from, hey, I have credit card numbers and you want them, now to, I want to know everything about your population base and I want to capitalize on that to either destabilize your government, right? With Canada, we're in an election year kind of thing. The stakes are much higher. And so now we're entering an arena of a legal conversation. We're entering in a human, right? Like a literal, this is an anthropological conversation now, more than a technological conversation. And so from my perspective, that's a huge change.
So what does that mean for a CISO of a mid-market regulated enterprise, right? Could be financial services, could be healthcare, could be something else. I mean, I think the reality is that most compliance standards have a lot of the same controls. So whether you're talking about NIST or ISO or similar, even PCI DSS, there's still a lot of those commonalities between them all. But I think what you're talking about is a much larger conversation than simply, hey, we need to deploy a new firewall and a new IAM solution, and we should probably update our AV. How does that translate into what the CISO has to do to secure their organization?
Yeah, and I've had a long history of working for various security vendors. You mentioned a couple of them off the offset, and as a vendor of a security product, I've always found that we've kind of been at the source of that problem that you just described, which is, hey, you know what? Buy this toothpaste and your teeth will be shiny white and bright forever, right? And this is the toothpaste for you. When you think a little bit about what you're saying, hey, now we've got to kind of get beyond technology, and you talk about that 1,000 person company. I was with a client this morning and I said, the 1,000 seat company is an interesting one, because if you're a 60,000 seat bank, chartered bank in Canada, and you're regulated and you have auditors and you have OSFI and you have all of these standards, and you mentioned PCI DSS and you mentioned a whole collection of other ones. You have standards, you have to audit to these standards, and it's kind of, I won't say cut and dried, but you've got some very prescriptive things that you have to do. When you're a CISO in 1,000 person shop, you're kind of on the cusp of unmanageability. And I'll qualify that statement. If you're small and you're 100 or 200 seats, you've pretty much got IT locked up. You've got 100 agents to deploy to 100 machines, and you kind of know where those machines are at all different times. When you've got 60,000 machines, you kind of understand that you need rigor, process. You've got staff to back it up, budget to back it up, and all this good stuff. And that 1,000 piece, and this is Canada, by the way, that 500 to 2,000 person enterprise, that's basically Canada. That's our bread and butter in terms of size of enterprise. You've probably got 40 companies in this country that are over 10,000 people in size, realistically, right? And I'm talking about the ones that are not like in construction, heavy equipment, or mining, right? I'm talking about technology heavy companies. And so you look at that 1,000-person shop and you say, okay, so you're kind of at this point where you've got the burden of complexity, but you don't generally have the resources behind you. And those people in the 1,000-person area are receiving that message from the vendor, right? So I set the stage with that one saying, you know what, you buy this security in a box, you're going to be great, right? And so many people will do that. And I call it the UTM approach to security, where you're going to buy this all-in-wonder, firewall box. And I take nothing away from these vendors that are good products, great people behind them, and all this good stuff. But in those boxes, you will not find procedure. In those boxes, you will not find proper configuration best practices. You will not find visibility into the severity of the attack landscape or the intelligence necessary to counteract today's cyber criminals. The biggest message I leave with CISOs and executives that I talk to, particularly on the smaller enterprise, is that you need to understand that you are a target. You need to understand that your data is important. Your data is valuable. And if the answer is like, well, no, all we do is manufacture tiny screws, why would you care about us? And the answer to that is, well, don't you have customers, right? Don't those customers have customers? Don't you have people working for you that care about you? Right now, I'm serving as the regional vice president of a company called Armis, right? So we help our clients secure their operational technology and IoT type technology. And I often hear this question about, well, why do I have to secure these devices? And the answer is, well, very simple. In the IT world, a bad day is when you lose your data or somebody erases your database. In the OT world, operational technology world, a bad day is when somebody dies, right? When you take out an elevator, when you take out an escalator, when you take out a power plant, when you take out water treatment facilities, the stakes are getting much higher. And so getting your head around your data, what it is and what its power is probably the biggest advice I could give to a security executive.
So we've talked a little bit about securing access to data and also securing access to systems. And I think in some cases the conversation will revolve around the same thing, which is who, right? Who is accessing that data? Who is accessing those systems? Do you see that there are tools and techniques that are doing a better job than others in terms of validating that it's the right who, that it is in fact the right person accessing the right systems or the right data?
So what you're really talking about, Ian, is context. Who is only one part of the equation. And so what we've graduated from is this era where we had a who accessing a what, right? Actually, we didn't even have a who accessing a what. We had a who, right? We had a who accessing a system, and there you go. And so we graduated from that to a who accessing a what, and then the who accessing a what and what time. And so now where we are in this era is, hey, we need to establish a context of access, period, end of story. And how does that work? Well, I'll use myself as an example. So you got this guy, Ajay, he accesses this type of information generally from this time to this time. Great. So if Ajay starts accessing this data in a different context, wrong time of day, wrong geolocation, wrong, or something different in general, the context doesn't match. And so the interesting part here is we're no longer trying to build a book of here's Ajay, here's his username, his password. Now it's here's an entity, right? We're going to call it an entity. Here's the context of data access in general. So this is the data. This is how it's generally accessed. Here's the class of person that usually accesses it. And this is the ways they generally access it. And we're going to build a kind of baseline and use this kind of analytics element to it or data science element to it. And so getting away from usernames and passwords, and that's why when we talk about IAM, modern IAM today, people are like, well, yeah, I have, and I'm just picking one out of, I have CyberArk, I have a password keeper, so I've got IAM nailed. My answer to that is no, you have a really good password keeper, right? But you don't necessarily have IAM put together. Because IAM as a general notion, you're going to have, yes, an element of authentication. So there's your CyberArk, there's your product, right? Coming right back to your point. You've got this product, and I didn't want it to be about product, but let's go, right? So you've got this product that does a great job being a product. But what you don't have is a way to check and see what the checks and balances of the utilization of those credentials are, right? So what data was accessed? Should that data be accessed? Is that data even classified? And so this comes right back to this beginning of this podcast, right? When we were talking about follow the data. Organizations today first thing as a CISO and as a CIO, Chief Information Officer, is you need to understand what data you have, right? What data are you collecting? What data do you have? You are the custodian of this data. And if you don't think you're the custodian of this data, you probably need to read PIPA one more time. Because it doesn't matter if you're storing it in the cloud or if you're storing it in a cloud provider or a CRM, ServiceNow, Salesforce, pick one, doesn't matter. You're responsible as the collector of that data, as a custodian of that data. Therefore, if your cloud service provider gets popped and your client's data is all over the place, you can't just say, well, it was them, right? If you read the T's and C's of any of the cloud service providers, they will tell you that they're responsible for the security of the cloud, right? They're going to do whatever they can to secure the infrastructure. But if your data in the cloud gets popped, breached due to, Amazon, S3 bins left wide open. We see this. We're seeing it over and over and over again. Is that a failure in authentication? Is that a failure in IAM? No, not so much. That's a failure in properly building a structure that will support IAM. The person who accessed that data probably had credentials. They probably had access rights. It doesn't mean the access rights were correct. And so getting back to your point, we need to kind of get away from a productized and a simplified version of IAM and start building contexts around data access. I think that's going to be the next phase. And so analytics engines, you're seeing those pop out. You're seeing SIMs and SIEMs getting smarter. You're seeing all sorts of other analytics type companies who are bringing much smarter ways to authenticating users. I like UEBA as a term, right? User and entity behavior analysis. That's kind of a really great area to kind of attach to IAM type infrastructure.
So I think that you hit upon one area there, which is challenging, particularly for that mid-sized financials or regulated institution, which is, okay, you've got some tools and you have enough complexity there where you don't know everybody's name anymore, and you probably don't physically go see these desktops on a regular basis, and who knows where the mobile devices are at. But the reality is that even if you had budget to go hire another 5 people, the 5 people aren't necessarily going to be there, right? We live in a world where I think the stat I saw recently was 1 million cybersecurity jobs left unfilled this year alone. How do you think about security organizations, within larger institutions having to staff up and maybe that staff not being there?
It's a difficult, very, very difficult situation right now because of the skills gap that we have, and more so the formidability of the adversary, right? So let's say you're a small company, but you're brokering in very, very critical information, right? So let's say you happen to be a provider to a bank or a small payment processor, whatever the case may be. You've got sensitive data, access to sensitive data, HR systems, whatever the case may be. Your data is important. You have to understand the type of data that you have, the formidability of the adversary. And so generally speaking, most folks in that 1,000-ish era are probably going to be less successful staffing it themselves and more successful augmenting their staff with a service provider or a second tier, a red phone type provider who can help them be the next best thing when it comes to security. The role that I'm seeing right now proliferating the most is the vCISO role, the virtual CISO role, where you've got access now to seasoned CISO professionals who no longer are CISOs of a single entity, but rather are acting as a CISO of many entities or acting as advisors to CISOs because they've got this level of experience. This is actually becoming a broadening field. As a matter of fact, my network is starting to fill more and more with these vCISOs, and I talk to them frequently and I ask them, hey, so you guys looking for gigs? They're like, no, we're turning them away actually because of the fact that we don't have enough skills. Again, they're suffering the same problem we are. But in that 1,000 seat area where you're going to have to go out there and attract, train, retain, right, and then keep interested, right? These highly volatile, I'll call them volatile security resources, is probably not going to be a workable solution for the short term. I see what's going to happen is where you're going to start enlisting the help of external agencies, like there's like IR professional shops and security consulting outfits and so on, and these vCISOs to kind of be a virtual extension to your team. And they will participate in your board meetings, they'll participate in your strategy sessions and help you build a security framework, and then maybe partner with a managed security service provider, right, to kind of deploy that. And sometimes they can be one and the same. Or if you really wanted to do the proper separation of duties, get a vCISO on one side, on one hand, who is not affiliated with your MSSP. And so then you have this series of checks and balances organizationally in place that you can make sure that the right things are happening at the right time.
So if you were thrust into a mid-sized institution and whatever the reason was, maybe there was a breach or maybe they just hadn't hired a CISO yet and hadn't prioritized it. And for some reason, there's a compelling event that says, yeah, we got to hire this role right now. and we need Ajay in there today. What does that 30-60-day plan look like for you to come into a new organization? Maybe there hasn't been as much infrastructure put in place yet. How do you prioritize and how do you go about securing that organization?
Yeah, it comes back to my thought about follow the data. So that first 30 days is unfortunately going to sound a lot like an interrogation, but it's basically going to be talking to the stakeholders of the business, make sure they understand what they're in the business of doing, right? So if you've got client information, where is it stored, right? I talked to a government official a little while ago of a certain country. I'm not going to get into any specific details, but I said to him, hey, listen, you're the custodian of citizen information. Yes. Where's it stored? And he goes, you know what? As the information officer of this organization, I can't even tell you. That's frightening, right? But that's kind of what we are staring down today. So if you go into an organization today, and let's say there's a breach, or let's say there's a leak, or maybe there's just like a regulatory finding, right? Or a lot of what's happening, by the way, gosh, and this was a chapter in the 2020 edition of Canadian Cybersecurity, was vendor management, right? Vendor management, now people are asking for things like right to audit, right? If you're going to be a vendor of mine, I want a right to audit you, right? To see, or you need to put forward ISO certifications, or I want to see your SOC 2 paperwork, things like that. This is real, right? And if you can't present that stuff, right, you're going to get whacked by your own clients, which is not what you want to do. Like, it's hard enough to get clients in general. You don't want to be at odds with them. And so to your point, entering into something, okay, let's figure out what the data is, right? Great. Now that we've identified the data, now we have to kind of see what the processes are around that data, created, storage, movement, destruction, lay down that framework. Because if you don't know where and what your data is, it doesn't matter what controls you have in place. They're not going to stop that data from being accessed or moved around by the wrong people. Great example I can give you is CASB, right? These CASB type products that have all been all the rage over the last couple of years. People are buying these CASB products to secure the data because it's stored in the cloud. But once people have credentials into your cloud system and they have access to all the data, it doesn't really matter. Because if you've got CASB saying, yep, there's your data, and there it goes, right? I mean, great. As opposed to, you know what, no, we're going to tag the data. We need to identify the data. Now the CASB is going to be leveraging those data tags to make sure the right people are accessing that data. Oh, wait a minute, they're trying to send it? No, they can't do that. Or that data can't move in this way. It has to be encrypted. So you can see, I'm going to give you an example of a CASB, great product. But a CASB poorly deployed is like a firewall poorly deployed, like an antivirus poorly deployed. It doesn't matter. And so this is the data. This is the type of data that it is. These are the types of people who should have access to this data for this period of time. We're going to tag this data, identify it using this and whatever technology that we have, watermarking, regardless, right? It's almost irregardless because you can literally pick what the technologies are going to be in whatever sectors that you choose to deploy them. And so that 30 days, identify the data, just identify it. Then 60, follow it. Okay, how does that data move around? Right? How does that data get created? How does it get collected? Is it being collected securely? Are we using forms? Are the forms HTTPS encrypted? Yes, I know it sounds pedantic to say that. Are our certificates expired? What do we do to manage our certificates? So you can see we're starting with the basics of what's my data, then it's where's that data. And then 90, we try and put together a real program around managing that data. And yeah, somewhere in there, we start looking at buying product to make sure that happens properly.
So in those conversations that you're having with stakeholders, how do you juggle the trade-off between having a really secure organization and actually enabling the business to function? Because I think the trap that folks can fall into is if you turn everything up to 11, you're going to be super safe and super secure and no work is going to get done, period. On the other hand, of course, is the opposite where, yeah, data is freely accessible. It's because it's readable by everyone in the world, like back to your S3 bucket example. Great, super accessible, not super secure. How do you juggle or how do you balance those conversations?
Yeah, security is interesting because there's a couple of trends that, or a couple of themes that I'll revisit here. So the first thing is users will always trade convenience for security all day long, every day. Logging into your bank. Do you need a password? Yes. Okay. Do you want to pick a complex password? I don't know. It has to be something I can remember. Oh, I'll just cache it in my browser. Game over. Then somebody gets access to your computer, they access to your bank, and yada yada. You get the idea, right? So that's the human intervention part. And then on the flip side of that, you've got this constant trade-off between usability and security in general. And so what you don't want your users, you don't want your general climate to be such that security is viewed as an obstruction, right, to getting things done, to getting business done. And so the right way to do this is to align security with the business goals of your organization. And I'll qualify that as well. So for example, If I'm sitting in a room with an operating committee of a large corporation, doesn't matter what they're in, let's say they're in tech, and you talk to them about, hey, we need to deploy multi-factor authentication. Really simple, right? So when people log in to their stuff, getting rid of using the passwords, are going to do, bio, or we're going to use a little fob or a token. Doesn't matter, multi-factor, okay? Oh, you know what, Ajay, that's going to be complicated. A lot of people, there's going to be a cost, and people then support and the help desk and things like that. So, okay, great. So let's talk a little bit about what it means to not have multi-factor, right? What are we in the business of? We're in the business of technology. Okay, so we have intellectual property. Correct. You don't want that intellectual property to be breached, right? And example after example after example, right? We've got a carrier here in Canada. Recently, their source code was on the internet. Same thing for a major Canadian bank, source code found on the internet. And in places like Pastebin, right? Pastebin and all these just general file / code sharing stub systems. And so you kind of get them, you have a business discussion about it, saying, look, it's going to be detrimental to the business if this occurs. So what we need to do is we need to find a way that would be very, very convenient for our users to deploy the security measure, but that would also make it more sustainable for our business. I always encourage executives to answer the question of what does Cyber Armageddon look like in their world? And Cyber Armageddon can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So for example, if you're in the business of intellectual property, code, whatever the case could be, your code's stolen, your code's leaked. The next thing you know, there's a generic version of your software coming out of some part of the world that doesn't necessarily have a lot of appreciation for copyright, and your business is under the table, right? That's an example. And so to just say, hey, we're going to do MFA, and people start to moan and groan about, having to carry a little key fob, which, by the way, that's like 2000 and late if that's what you're going to do with MFA, but I'm giving you that example. Rather than say, listen, we're deploying this stuff, and it's going to make our business better, and it's going to make our products better, and it's going to make our product cheaper, or we're going to have a competitive advantage, whatever the case may be. You got to have that business conversation around it, because otherwise it does become an annoyance, and you do walk that line between security and convenience that people will cast away security all the time. And that starts at the exec, by the way. The executives are not generally very tech savvy sometimes, especially in certain sectors of business. Not everybody is the head of a software programming company and has those deep technical chops. Sometimes you're going to deal with somebody who's in food preparation, has been a baker his entire career, and just knows how to bake quality bread and use quality ingredients, which is not a bad thing. To articulate to them, hey, look, you know what? If over a Christmas period, our assembly line gets shut down by a piece of malware, we're not making bread anymore. And if we're not making bread anymore, we're disappointing our customers. If we're disappointing our customers, they're going to go buy stuff from somebody else. You're putting that into a business context as opposed to, hey, man, here's a quote for some antivirus. It's going to cost you $50,000. Can I have some money now? No, go away. I'm going to forget you called. You know what I'm saying? And it's a different answer. And, I've gotten the call. I got the call on December 26th from a food manufacturing company that was shut down by malware. And the whole Christmas break from 26 to whatever, they were shut down. They lost millions of dollars and they couldn't ship product. And their clients were disappointed. Their distributors were disappointed. They had to find alternate product. These guys made frozen food, for God's sakes. It's malware, and security is not just an IT problem anymore. Trust me on this one. You're seeing municipalities getting popped left, right, and center because of their poor security controls. Ransomware. People are paying the ransom. You got to understand this for business continuity. Hey, I got to pay the ransom because I have to continue, making tiny screws. That's what my company does if I don't pay the ransom. But then you think about what you're financing here, and you're like, now we're making this problem worse. Like, you're making it worse. Stop doing it. But yet, by the same token, I have to continue making these tiny screws. If you don't have the conversation before this happens, you're going to find that you're going to have a very difficult conversation. And you're not going to be able to actually have an intelligent conversation while you're panicking. It's like those game shows when they ask people questions while they're on the roller coaster, and they're very simple questions, like, spell cat. And the guy's like, CAP. Like, it's terrible. I mean, they're making these terrible mistakes. This is literally what we're doing in cybersecurity right now. We're asking people to make really impactful technology and policy decisions in times of crisis. And, I'm going to keep that one, actually, the cybersecurity roller coaster. Don't take that one from me.
Well, maybe for your third book.
No, I think that one might be on ice for now. But then again, you never know.
So it's actually a perfect segue to my final question, and I'll give you a little bit of air cover for this question. So the question is, what is the highest stress cybersecurity incident you've been involved with, or, and this is the air cover, maybe heard from somebody else, and what were the lessons learned that you took from it?
I'm trying to be diplomatic. The highest severity one was because there was loss of life. And at the end of everything we do is a person. There's people who are materially affected by a lot, right? I mean, and we live in an era of isolation and social media and mental illness and a whole bunch of things where people are just not being very empathetic. And, was involved in a situation where people's personal, information or personal situations, I guess you could say, situation of a very personal nature, I would leave it at that, was divulged. And, as a result of that, unfortunately, the sad reality of trial by social media and shaming and resulted in a very, very negative outcome for some people. And so I think about it, actually. I think about it very, very often. And, I am not unlike anybody else, far from perfect, not empathetic, not a model, anything all the time. And I don't claim to be, and I never would. But you think of stuff like that, and it's very sobering. You think of data and computer related crime, you want to call it that. There's personal things people don't want out there. And then they get out there, and then people get very, very affected, and their families get affected. And I talked about it earlier on, right? You had financial capital, intellectual capital, and political capital. And, Ajay had it all figured out, right? In Cybersecurity 2018, that was my introduction. I talked about that. I said, these are the three types of cybercrime capitalization. And then, bam, the advent of the fourth category, personal capital, right? And then Facebook happened, and then Cambridge Analytica happened, and then Humana happened, and then Ashley Madison happened, and all this stuff. And this is human capital. Like, this is human capital. This is like not. This is not just this, the caramel secret here, right? This is people's lives, and so I try to remind myself that at the edge of everything I do is a human being, and you got to remember that. So, in terms of being involved with stuff, the worst stuff I've ever been involved with is when human safety and human well-being was affected, and that's impactful, very, very impactful.
Well, I really appreciate your time. Where can folks go to learn more about the book that you have coming out?
Well, the book they have has come out already. It came out in October. You can go to clxforum.org if you want a soft copy of that. Of course, you can always hit me up on Twitter @AKSSecure, LinkedIn @AKSSecure. But it's always a pleasure, Ian.
Awesome. Thanks, Ajay.
Take care, man.
Thank you for joining us today on the Identity and Cybersecurity podcast, sponsored by Plurilock. Join us again next time for more insightful conversations about cybersecurity and digital identity in today's hottest industries. To learn more about behavioral biometrics and other advanced identity technologies, visit plurilock.com.